Okay, thanks. Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tom Saul. I work as a product manager at Sedex, and I've been working on helping Sedex to develop the next iteration of its risk assessment tool. And really, as we were thinking about what kind of training and support we need to make available to effectively launch this product, we realized that it was important not only to provide training and guidance around the kind of technical use of the tool and how you can use it from a user perspective, but also to really provide the more kind of broader contextual information about how this tool sits into the wider risk assessment and due diligence process. And that really means probably first answering some of those more fundamental questions around risk assessment. So really starting with what do we mean by risk in the context of human rights and environmental issues in supply chains. And then, of course, why is it important for businesses to conduct a risk assessment, and how can they conduct an effective risk assessment, and what are the next steps that then enable organizations to make sure that they are taking action that can lead to better outcomes for people and the environment. And then by answering those questions, that really helps us to begin to understand where the Sedex tools fit into that process, whether it be the risk assessment tool, but also our self-assessment questionnaire and the SMETA audit methodology. So what is their role in that process? And also, importantly, what are their limitations? What other actions should businesses be taking in order to complete that effective risk assessment? Of course, many of our members would already be undertaking these kind of risk assessments, particularly here in the UK, where we have the Modern Slavery Act requiring many organisations to understand at least the risk of modern slavery occurring within their operations and their supply chains. And equally, if you're a member of an initiative like the UTI or FNet, you'll be already conducting a broader risk assessment so far. But really, so hopefully, what's included in this guidance won't be news to everyone. But we felt that there'd been so much development at that kind of framework level with the UN Guiding Principles, the OECD's Responsible Business Conduct Guidance, and the ETI's own Human Rights Due Diligence Framework, that it would be quite useful to really build on those established frameworks to develop a more kind of general guide to risk assessment that all Sedex members can hopefully find helpful, whether it be those who are really new to human rights due diligence and looking to understand how to set a risk assessment strategy, or users of the risk assessment tool who are looking to strengthen their risk management processes. So to that end, we engaged Ergon Associates as kind of leading experts on this topic to help to develop a general guide to risk assessment in supply chains, which we'll be using to publish both as a standalone resource for people to use, but also incorporating into that training that we deliver as part of the release of the risk assessment tool. So I'm really pleased to say that we have Stuart Bell, Director at Ergon, here with us today. And in advance of the publication of that guidance, he's going to, hopefully over the next 20 minutes or so, really bring that guidance to life. And there will as well be an opportunity for any questions that you have at the end of that. So yeah, we're open to questions and being challenged. And so do make a note of any questions that you have, and we'll take those at the end of the session. So without further ado, I will hand over to Stuart, who can take you through that presentation.
Well, good morning, everybody. In your agenda, this session, I think, was billed as best practice in risk assessment. I think that's slightly overclaiming what certainly I would choose to call it, because I think risk assessment is an emerging field. There's many different ways of doing it. We're learning all the time, both as issues evolve, as supply chains become more complex. So really what I want to talk about is some general approaches to how you can go about doing risk assessment, and some of the learnings, I think, from different ways and different techniques that different organisations have pursued. I think it can be very daunting when thinking about risk assessment if you've got a long, a complex, a geographically spread supply chain, where do you start? There's loads of stuff happening out there all the time. What is the most important? What information do you rely on? So I think it's quite easy to get a bit overwhelmed at the start of a risk assessment process. But the important thing to remember is it is a process. So just like every other business challenge or operational challenge, it's important to put in place some building blocks, some elements. One thing leads to another. It's all about the process that you put in place. There's no right way of doing it, but it's about adapting and developing a process that's right for your organisation. So I want to focus on four things, really. First of all, what do we mean by risk? And how do we categorise different sorts of risks? How do we identify where and what those risks are? How do we prioritise and grade and escalate those risks so that we focus on the most important ones? And what do we do about risks? What do we do next? Because risk assessment is not an end in itself. It's about knowing where and what action you need to take. So, I mean, we've been doing different sorts of risk assessments and impact assessments for a number of years. A lot of it is driven by modern slavery requirements, and I think there's lots of learnings from the work that I'm sure many of you have been doing about understanding where modern slavery risks lie. That can all be translated into broader understanding of human rights and indeed environmental risk. But there's a number of different levels of what risk might mean. And in terms of our sort of professional practice, I mean, we do risk assessments for brands through supply chains. That can either be specific products, it can be globally, it can be in particular countries. We also do work for international financial institutions like the World Bank. And they think about risk in quite a different way. They're thinking about the risk to a particular transaction of, bad things happening in a project that they're financing. So they're thinking about risk in more of a kind of traditional financial institution way. We also do work on particular product lines, so agricultural commodities. Clients will come to us and say, well, what about mangoes? And so you have to think about, well, where are they being grown? What are those particular activities? So there's lots of different ways of coming into risk. It can be all the way through supply chains or through having pre-identified a particular product or country. Now, I'm sure we've all seen these sorts of slides about just general, why do we do labour rights? Why do we do human rights work? There's a lot of media coverage. There's increasing media coverage. But we just picked out some particular stories to try and illustrate different types of risk, because we need to sort of think about what does it mean. What does risk mean for you as organisations? What does it mean for different sorts of workers or the environment? Now, the classic definition of risk is it's a combination of a hazard, financial fraud, for example, and the probability of that hazard happening. So it's a combination of the bad thing and the likelihood. And it's a theoretical calculation. So we're not talking about things that we definitely know have happened. We're thinking about things that might happen and the likelihood that they might happen in future. But those sorts of issues are often based on the information and the knowledge that we have, which can come from these sorts of stories. So there's different dimensions of risk. And as I was just saying, I mean, it can be around a known issue in a particular country. So slave labour in Brazil. and that's obviously clearly a supply chain issue. But it could be something in your own operations. So we couldn't resist, obviously, having a picture of Trump. So hotel workers in Dubai at a Trump hotel. So within the operation, or at least the franchise of that particular company. But who are those workers? Are they direct employees, or are they agency workers? But it's an operational risk, not necessarily supply chain. And what sort of risks are we talking about? So IKEA drivers living in trucks for months, is that a breach of the law? In what country? Have their human rights been breached, or is it some other problem? Well, clearly, it's not a satisfactory situation, but is it a health and safety issue? Is it a working hours issue? So often the kind of information that we get, we need to interpret in certain ways to understand what the nature of risk is. And what are human rights risks? And we're talking generally about labour risks within the human rights field, but increasingly risk is being talked about in terms of broader human rights. So there are international instruments aimed at governments, so ILO conventions, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. These are conventions and treaties which are aimed at governments to implement, but they clearly have implications for businesses. So we've got a set of international human rights instruments, we've got a set of international environmental conventions. So we need to define broadly what the kind of nomenclature of risk is. And finally, risk for who? Risk for what? Now, traditionally, risk for a business is thought about in terms of the impact on the business. So it'll be operational disruption, financial loss, those sorts of issues. In human rights and environment, that is not what risk is about. Risk is about the impact externally on communities, on workers, on the environment. So we can, now it's, the impact on a company's reputation of something going wrong in one of those fields is obviously very real and will be a serious consideration for any company. But in terms of thinking about risk assessment, we need to reorientate ourselves towards thinking, what is the external impact on people, on rights holders in the jargon, and the external impact of the company's business, supply chain operations on environment. So as Tom alluded to in the introduction, risk assessment is part of a broader due diligence process. So since the publication of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights back in 2011, this broader picture of due diligence on human rights, I think, has become, accepted and more widespread in terms of how it's understood. And risk assessment is only one small part of the overall cycle, starting off with having a policy, embedding it within an organisation, understanding what your risks are and identifying them, and then taking action, monitoring, tracking, amending the policy. So although risk assessment is important, it's important also to remember that it is just one part of that broader cycle. It's not an end in itself. It's only about understanding what might be going wrong so that you can do something about it, so you can manage that risk. So in terms of thinking about different exam categories, if we go a bit deeper into the types of risk. So I said a moment ago that we've got these various international conventions and agreements, but they are set at a very high level. And when it comes down to it, if you count up the number of potential human rights risks, for example, that are cited in the various covenants and conventions, there's probably 80 or 90. And that in itself can feel quite overwhelming. But when you actually analyse them, many of them, for most businesses, will be entirely irrelevant for you. So sort of right to marriage, right to education, things like that, they're state responsibilities. So one important thing to start off with when thinking about risk is what is relevant for us as a business in terms of our activities. And that can be quite a good sort of comforting way of narrowing down the field so that you can actually focus on what is relevant, what you're likely to be impacting on. We can categorise rights by various, in terms of various buckets, and we can also trace how those rights fit into the current sort of frameworks that Sedex and other organisations have. So in terms of SMETA pillars, we can sort of trace across where different rights might fit into work and knowledge that you already have. You can also start to trace who are the rights holders or who are the impacted communities and organisations that are likely to be affected by those rights. And then at a sort of lower level and more detailed, granular level, what are the specific issues which are going to be within those particular categories? So if we think about the general risk category of working conditions, workers are the likely main impacted rights holder group, and there's a whole set of this normal sort of non-compliance issues that we find in audits that fall within that. But when thinking about rights holders and impacted groups, it can also be very useful to think about vulnerability, because rights and impacts do not impact equally on different types of worker. So women, children, vulnerable minorities, workers in precarious situations are more vulnerable in terms of the likely impact on them for abuses of rights. So a lens of vulnerability can be quite helpful when thinking about, well, who's working in our supply chain, who's working at our suppliers, thinking about different sorts of groups of workers and identifying them in terms of their vulnerability will give an added kind of impetus and understanding to risk assessment. So the risk assessment process itself, I mean, we can break it down into a number of different steps. Not all of them necessarily need to be taken. You might already have mapped your supply chain, so you don't need to do that. You might already have got a good understanding of who your suppliers are, so you don't necessarily need to do that. But these are just the sort of basic building blocks in order to come to an understanding of what risks might be in a supply chain. But they all drive towards action at the end. So the first element of that was about understanding what you're buying, where you're buying, who's supplying, mapping your supply chain. I'm not going to say too much about this. I'm sure most of you have either done it to a greater or lesser degree or are grappling with issues about mapping. It can be very complex if you've got ingredients, components, multiple tiers of a supply chain. A shifting supply base obviously is a complicated business, and it's quite easy to stand up and say, well, you just need to map where stuff is being bought from. But we don't underestimate that. It can take time. If you're asking suppliers to provide information on who's supplying them, there are very real commercial barriers to why they will tell you that information. But I think the important thing about mapping is to try and get as complete a picture as possible, but don't get hung up on the fact that it's not complete. Just because you don't have a full picture down to tiers 3, 4, 5 doesn't mean you can't start to risk assess what you do know. It's important to carry on that process and perhaps have a staged program of trying to get more visibility over supply chains, but work with what you've got in the short term while you gather that extra information. So assuming that you have got a reasonable picture, perhaps certainly tier 1, perhaps tier 2, so you know where suppliers are located, you know what sectors they're in, clearly, you can then start to understand the sorts of risks that they might be facing or the sorts of impacts that they might be having. And really there are two elements to this. The first is the country context. So what are the risk issues within shared by all suppliers, particularly in that particular country, and what are the sectoral risks? And if you combine these two, you get a contextual risk idea for the sorts of issues that might be affecting that supplier. So these are not specific factors for your particular supplier, they are more general factors. So if we think about at a country or regional level, just generally, what's the human rights situation in that particular country? Is it a repressive government? Are there civil and political rights that the population is able to enjoy? What's the level of law enforcement? Is most countries actually have pretty good labour laws, pretty good environmental laws? The problem is enforcement and capacity to enforce. What's the level of poverty? Poverty is generally associated with labour abuses, with environmental abuses. What sort of internal or external migration might there be? Again, migrants are at more risk of abuse. So issues like that can give you a reasonable picture of the level of risk at a country level. In terms of sectors, is the sector generally low-skilled? Is the sector feminised in terms of workforce? Is it generally populated by migrants? If it's a low-skilled sector, it will be more attractive for migrant workers. Is it seasonal? Is it temporary? So do you have groups of workers who come and go and not particularly well documented and have less rights because of that? And is it a hazardous sector? Is it using dangerous equipment? Is it energy intensive? Is it water intensive? So there's a number of other factors which are just generic to the type of sector that you're in, which you can add into the mix there. So I mean there's lots of different risk tools and maps and rankings using these sorts of factors. So we've been working with Sedex and Anthesis on thinking about the sort of inputs on these issues that can go into the risk assessment tool and the sort of information sources that can go into it as well. So that gives you a picture on what the contextual situation might be, but that might well have no bearing whatsoever on your specific suppliers. So you might know there's a lot of migrant workers in your supplier's particular sector, but actually if your supplier doesn't employ any migrant workers or has a very good, robust recruitment strategy for migrant workers, clearly they're not going to be affected by that risk in the same way. So there's a whole set of other supplier and site characteristics which need to be gathered, which can either mitigate or reduce the risk or improve your understanding of what those particular supplier risks might be. And these could be about the location of the site, the physical location, types of workers, what the types of contracts that they're on, the shift pattern on a particular site, how near a site is to local communities and urban areas. So you can get this sort of information from self-assessment questionnaires, from the new Sedex self-assessment questionnaire, from audits, from visits, from colleagues who've been to visit suppliers, worker feedback and hotlines, lots of sources of information about specific situation at a supplier site. So what tends to happen once you've gathered all this information together is that you've actually got quite a long list of either countries, suppliers, products, tiers, and different sorts of risk. So, and what we don't want a risk assessment process to end up with is the whole world red, flashing at you. You know, that's no help to anybody. So you've really got to work out a way of prioritising the most serious risks. Now, in human rights UNGP jargon, this is called doing a saliency analysis, which is really just another way of saying what are the highest risk, the highest priority issues. Saliency is generally understood as a combination of the scale of the risk, the scope, and the remediability. Scale being how grave is the risk. So one example would be for child labour. Children working after school hours to help out in a shop is not as serious as underage workers in a mine. It's both are child labour, but one is more serious, grave than the other. Scope is how widespread, how many people, what geographical area. Remediability, can it be put right? So if somebody is injured at work, they can get better. If they lose a leg, it can't be remediated. So you can work out a kind of coded scoring scale on those issues, which you can use to escalate and prioritise. And the other factor is likelihood. So again, coming back to probability, so how many reports of this particular issue, how many other suppliers have found this particular issue can inform a view on probability. You can end up with this kind of matrix of severity on one axis, likelihood on the other. So if you've got high severity risks, high likelihood, you end up in the red quadrant. That's your priority issues to deal with, essentially. And in terms of dealing with those issues, what you're trying to do is move risk issues in the red quadrant through mitigation, through risk management, into lower risk quadrants. So risk, so we've done all this work still at a reasonably theoretical level, using lots of sources of information, using information from suppliers and about suppliers, but it is still essentially probably desk-based. So what do you do with those highest risk issues? And it's desk-based and it's theoretical still. Well, there's some need to follow up. And you follow up for two reasons. First of all, to validate, to verify, is the risk that you think is there, is it real? And secondly, to start working on an action plan to address it. Now, the traditional way of checking, of following up, is through audits, but we really do need to ask ourselves, are they the best way of validating many risks? Audits are very good at identifying physical problems, documentation problems, etc., as we all know. But a lot of the kind of risk issues which we're talking about are more hidden, so forced labour, endemic social problems, which are driving risk. So increasingly there's a need, or certainly NGOs and many companies are now pushing for more in-depth, focused human rights impact assessments, which try and get under the skin of problems. You spend a lot more time on site and in communities, talking to stakeholders, talking to workers, talking to management about what their understanding of what risk is as well. And those can be single site, they can be regional, they can be product specific. So human rights impact assessments are more of a kind of deep dive to both, as I say, sort of verify that a risk really is an impact, is really happening, but also try and understand what the drivers, what the root causes are. And it's only by understanding what those root causes are that you can then start to develop an action plan to address some of those issues. So finally, taking action and mitigation. So in terms of action, there's a number of different levels. So depending on what the risk is, there might be some very reasonably simple actions, which are more along the lines of this kind of corrective action plan, which you can put in place with a supplier. So changing their management processes, improving their payment systems, putting more resource into human resource management, for example, and also considering how your own buying practices will impact on how that supplier is implementing labour standards. But there is also probably a strong likelihood that impact assessment will have uncovered the fact that the risk is being driven by something that is more widespread than just a single supplier. So a single supplier cannot really deal with this problem on its own. It's an endemic issue, it's sectoral, everybody's using migrant workers. The whole sector is low wage, low skilled, so what can you do about that? And that's when more of a collaborative approach, sectoral initiatives, MSIs, that sort of approach comes into play. And at a country level, the problem might be the government, it might be the law, it might be the minimum wage, it might be lack of enforcement. So again, what can you do collaboratively with other brands, with other suppliers in country to try and address some of those problems through lobbying? And there have been some interesting examples in recent years, Cambodia minimum wage, for example, of companies coming together and successfully lobbying governments to change the law. And finally, yes, in terms of your own internal policies, what can you do to strengthen your own processes, whether they're buying processes, monitoring, checking, engagement with suppliers to minimise risk as well. So I'm being waved at in terms of time now, so I will end there, and I should have some time for questions, I think.